Okay, so if we go back to the Perl 6 design documents, okay, and I'm going to go through all of it so we can get a really good picture of what they were trying to do back then. Because Raku was not, or Perl 6 at the time, right, was designed to be, typed language, but gradually typed. So it wasn't required, but they wanted to, have some flexibility. So they actually talked a lot about coercion. And so one of the early ones here, it says, any type name in an R value context is parsed as a single type value, expects no arguments, but it will respond to a function call interface, basically putting parentheses around it. And so you may use the name of type with parentheses as if it were a function, and an argument supplied is coerced to the type indicated by the type object. And if there's no argument in the parentheses, the type object returns itself. Okay, and it actually then gives the example here of actually throwing that into a variable. So this was designed to not just be like a literal, compiler finds type name and parentheses and it does some sort of special, compiler thing. No, it's actually saying, no, you call this function call on a type object, you should expect to get coercion. And all these examples are directly from the design documents, so there's no necessary guarantee that they work in current Raku. Then we have in the coercive types. All right, and then this one is mainly talking about in subroutines. And it basically says, hey, if you've got a type in outside parentheses, this is the desired end result, right? And the subsequent code will depend on that one and can guarantee that it's going to be that one. And what's inside, right, it will be the one that we can go from. And if we don't do it, we assume any, which is sort of how Raku works in general. You just assume any if you don't mention anything. But interestingly, it says here, in any case, the wide type is only indicative of permission to coerce. There still must be an available coercion routine from the wide type to the narrow type to actually provide the coercion. Okay, so the example here, right, we have subs and we have an option from a string with any, and that basically says, hey, if you pass me anything, I will allow you to convert it or coerce it to a string, and then the actual subroutine can guarantee that it's got a string. And if you just do parentheses, it's the same thing because any is the same as nothing. And then it gives this example here, these other two examples of my num cool, which is sort of the generic, you're maybe a string, you're maybe your number, you're maybe some, all this like in the core, everything can coerce to each other. X equals prompt, give me a number, and it will automatically convert that cool, because that input is probably stringy, into a number. And it also says we can do it on the return type, so that I don't have to worry about what I've got. It'll try to type enforce an integer and try to coerce into the integer. So this is all in those design docs. Then they have of, and it says containers enforce the type safety on setting, and subroutines enforce it on return. And you get this sort of sub. This is, you don't actually see as often these days. This is one, it's still allowed. You can do this. You can say sub, get pet of animal. There's like 3 different ways that you can indicate what you're going to return. And you see all of them on here. And actually, none of these 3 are the most common way to do it. All 3 are allowed. Right, the other one is inside your signature, you do dash arrow, say I'm outputting this type. That's the one that most people use today. But all of these,
they do the same thing? Or
yes, they all do the same thing. Because at the core, all of these are just you're calling like a method on the sub itself to set its return type. And it's interesting, like this is how many different ways we ended up with, and they all make sense for different reasons. It is surprising that we kept all of them. And then it says you can do a coercion type on the return. Right? But then it says for a container, however, the use of the coercion type is the of coerces upon setting rather than returning the value. So this is actually something I thought was very interesting. They were thinking about, well, when does the coercion happen? So if you think about it, what are we saying? Well, okay, we get done with a routine. Well, we're going to coerce at the end. So, right? But when we set something, if you have like a, going back to this one where we have my num, the question is, do we coerce as soon as we set it? Or do we wait until it gets used, and then we'll coerce it to what's needed? And the design doc said, well, here's when we're going to do it. Then we have this, this isn't, I guess, I think we all take this for granted, but they actually thought of this as a true coercion. Said if a sigil is followed by comma, blah, 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 but it would be taken to be a sigil without a name rather than punctuation, and this allows you to use sigils as coercion operators. So they were actually thinking of this where you put in just dollar sign or at symbol or percentage with a parentheses. They were thinking, no, this is coercion. I normally think of this as just setting context. I think that's how most of us talk about it. Okay, I'm going to look at this in list context or in scalar context. But they were like, no, this is coercion. Interesting. Then we have subset coercion. And this was interesting because this was a sort of a very, we were trying to find, part of when they were going through these design documents, they wanted to take sort of inconsistencies and make them a little bit more consistent and more logical. And then they literally start off here and saying, note that the declaration of the of type for a subset doesn't really mean what of type means elsewhere in the language. And it says, in fact, when used as a coercion, a subset type returns a bool. Y'all, that's not coercion. I don't think that's coercion. But it kind of, I guess, makes sense in how they wanted to use it. But anyway, so you see here we have like if even some value of x, and it says, okay, I want you to coerce it into even, and then that would cause the loop to go because it's boolified. That was an interesting one. I did not know about that one when I was researching. Yes?
If will normally boolify anyway, so would that still boolify if you didn't have the F?
Yeah, I mean, that's per the design docs. It literally says it would return a bool, rather than something that is boolifiable. Yeah, this is not in current Raku, by the way. Yeah. Then we have enum coercion. And again, I use scare quotes because I'm not really sure if I like all of this here. So it says the enumeration type name itself may be used as a coercion operator from either the key name or a value. Now, first, the argument is looked up as a key. If that is found, the enum object is returned. If the key name lookup fails, the value is looked up using an inverted mapping table, which might have duplicates if mapping is not one-to-one. And actually, when you think about this, when I was going through this, and I was like, okay, but so the way that enums work in Raku, they're a lot more powerful. Definitely powerful, a little wonkier to use, because you can set the key and value types. It's not required to be, it's got to be, I think the values have to be, the keys have to be strings or numbers, but then the values can be anything. So you could have string and string, which now means you could have keys and values that overlap as well. I'm not really sure why you would want to do this, but you could. And then this lookup is saying, okay, well, we're going to do first a key, but then it becomes ambiguous. Am I looking up by a key or am I looking up by a value? Yeah, but that's how it was set up in the design docs. I don't think they were necessarily thinking that people would do that. And so they have these different things. And then this day one where they have the day double colon parenthesis, that's not even really coercion, so I don't know why they included it here. That's just standard like namespacing-ish type thing. But that's how they wanted to go about it. Oops. There you go. All right. Then we get to typecasting. And it says here, the expected semantics of just that is that of a type on which may or may not create a new object. So if you say Fido equals dog.newSpot, it will certainly create a new dog object because we called new. And does what we tell us. But if I say Fido equals dog spot, it might call dog new, or it might pull a dog with Spot's identity from a dog cache, or it might do absolutely nothing if Spot already knows how to be a dog. And I guess on the surface this kind of makes sense. We're basically saying, hey, I want a dog. I gave you Spot. Spot is a dog, so we don't need to do anything to Spot. Spot is already a dog. But if Spot is not a dog, we need to turn him into a dog somehow, hopefully, right? And then it says, this is an interesting one, it says, as a fallback, if no method responds to a coercion request, the class will be asked to attempt to do dog.new spot. So we're kind of hinting here that we have this idea of doing coercion, but it's maybe not fully solidified how we want it to go about. And then it says here, it is also possible, and often preferable, to specify coercions from the other end. That is, for a class to specify how to coerce one of its values to some other class. So if you define a method whose name happens to be of type name, you can view it as a coercion to that type. But that method is a regular method, even if its name happens to be a type name. This means the compiler does not enforce type, all this kind of stuff. So basically what we're saying is, if you create your own method, or your own class, you can put in this method string, and you have now created a coercion method. It's a long way for them to say that. Just do method, the type name, boom, return that value.
I mean, except it doesn't enforce what the return is.
Yeah, so you could though, and maybe this is one where they weren't really like thinking the docs through, but I guess it's just a not required one, but you could then add in a signature here that in and of itself does it. But they're basically warning you like, hey, I guess if it's like a coercion type and you don't return it, you're gonna error, so just make sure to do it. Design docu phase. All right, and then we have typecasting. So they say, oh, well, all methods you can export the corresponding multi. So I could say multi-method string is export, in which case you can now use both calling forms. And I could say x.string and string of x. And if the source class and destination class both specify a coercion routine, the ambiguity is settled by ordinary rules of dispatch. So x.string will always prefer that method form, and then the string f will prefer the functional form. So they were trying to get to it, but this was clearly not fully kind of worked out. Because these are coming from, if you've noticed, the different synopses we're pulling from 2 and 6 and 13. So I mean, these are kind of spaced out, and these documents are very large, and these references are very spurious across here. Then we get here, it says that because the name of an anonymous class is unknown, coercion to an anonymous class can only be specified by the destination class. Which I guess, again, makes sense because there's no name. You can't call a method on an unknown, like a non-existent name. Okay, so that's the design theory. That's pretty cool, but how has it actually worked in Perl, Raku? Because the actual implementation went through both names. So what can we do today? Well, we're going to say pre-coercion, so early, mid-2020. Up to that point, what could we do? Well, coercion was available via type object function calls. So we would have like class foo, and then we would say method int. I'm just going to return 42 because, right? And then I'd say my x equals foo.new, and then I say int foo. I guess I could have put in x. That's what I meant to do, but whatever. Both work. You can still coerce. It's a type object. And you get 42 out. And that will be how we convert. So we write our class. We say, hey, I'm writing my class foo, and I know how to coerce into an int. Awesome. And then we have, this one says, while it may look like the type object function call coercion is calling a method on the type object, bar, parenthesis, a, is actually really calling a.what.bar. All right? And then the little caveat, this does not work if call me is defined. And so this is, again, one of those, it's a little weird one because you think if I have bar, parenthesis, a, that I'm actually calling some method on bar. Right? I mean, this is what we would all assume. And actually, no. This gets kind of internally, munged as, no, we're going to take A, we're going to take its type object, and we are going to call its coercion method on it, and pass it in the A as its value, or itself. So I really should just be a.bar. But I just want to emphasize, like, it's actually calling this on the type of A. Bar actually has no involvement whatsoever with this, other than we're using its name. Okay? And so here you got an example. We have class bar, class foo, right? And I say, well, my A equals foo.new, and I say bar, right? And it calls in foo. Bar doesn't know how to convert foo in, all right? And that was it. actually. That was all we had for coercion up to 2020, right? Scalars couldn't be coercion typed. So if I said my string with the parentheses, as we saw in Daniel's talk, and I say always text, I would get this error. Coercion string any is insufficiently type-like to qualify a variable. And it's like, I want some constraints here or something. And so it's saying like, hey, I get that this is a coercion thing, but coercion things aren't types. They're coercion-y stuff. And we also couldn't do this with arrays. And this is also a kind of a really nice, useful one that I could say, oh, hey, I want this array to always contain strings, but I don't always want to pass it strings. And you notice, if I start off, if I do this my string as with the @ sigil, it'll say, oh, I get same thing, insufficiently type-like. But I actually found, as I was testing this out on some earlier versions of Raku, you could use the more explicit parameterized approach and put it in a scalar, and it would start to work. You'd think it was working until you tried to set anything to it, and then it blew up and said it was a type check fail with a very odd type check message that one doesn't really make any sense to me. I don't really understand how those types were getting in there. But so none of those could work. And those are both incredibly useful times where we would want to use coercion. We've got enum kind of half worked. So I've got my little days of the week here. I say day number 2, I get Wednesday, right? Because it's 0-based and Monday on the first one. So that's fine. And then I say, hey, tell me day, sat. And it gave me the type object. What? Clearly we saw in the design document, it tells you that should give me the day object in there. And what actually was happening here is that, and if you look in the docs for Raku, what they finally decided to do is they said, okay, we're only doing value lookups. That's good. Okay, we don't want to do both value and key and get those mixed up. And they said undefined values would return a type object, which is actually sort of consistent with how arrays would work. If you ask for an item at a position that doesn't exist, it will return the type object back. So I guess that's kind of consistent. But subsets don't work at all, and that is a nice little error message there. Cannot invoke this object uninstantiable even. So that one doesn't work. And when we wanted to coerce, how did coercion work? Well, basically, given a sub like subfoo bar with a coercion type, we would basically do, and this is not actually what's happening, that's why I say it's akin to, because I already see somebody who's going to be like, no, but actually in the coercion, no, all right? Just to make sense of sort of what we're doing. Basically ask, hey, is B a bar? If it is, great, let's go look at the next argument. We're good, all right? If B has if not, right, well, hey, does B have a method bar? It does? Okay, cool, we're going to call that method bar on B, and now that's what B is in our, we're going to bind that to B, and now we're going to the next argument. And then we die. That was sort of it. And that was kind of nice, but it can cause some problems. So think about square and rectangles, okay? We should be able to coerce between both of those, right? I mean, just like we can coerce between an int and a num or an int and a rat, and sometimes the coercion will fail. I mean, that's perfectly fine, right? But imagine I've got my classes, and we start with like class rectangle, we've got width or height, then we have a coercion to square. And then we have my class square is a rectangle, right? And it's with whatever, it's probably bad OO programming, I don't care, all right? Don't at me. And we have our method rectangle to convert it back, and we, it should, that one we can always do. The square method though will die if, right, the height and width aren't the same, and we make our new square. But what's the problem here? It's this method square. How does rectangle know about square? Now, if I do it all in one file, we can stub, just like what Daniel had to do in his. You can do a little stub class up at the top, and you've got it in here. But as projects grow and grow and grow, you kind of sometimes want to start splitting these out into different files, and we end up with a circular dependency problem, which is not very easily solvable. And so what we really want is, well, how can we make this work? And this is actually part of one of the impetuses that we had for kind of getting this work done, because I think it was Liz was saying, well, if you want to have a coercion from int to your class, there's no way to do it. You can't add, at least not, I mean, you can, but it's not as straightforward to add a new method into a core class like int. So if I want to make a square from int or something, you've got to go and augment it or do all this other kind of stuff. You don't want to go there. So we want to have a way to do that. So what happened then? VRorg, I don't know how we pronounce usernames, faithfully came across issue number 1285 on coercion type for parameterized roles, about which Jonathan said, "There's no reason this can't be made to work at some point in the future. It's just not entirely trivial to get there." To which Vadim responded to himself, apparently, "He is a busy man for whom time is even pricier luxury than it is to me. I can probably do it in a week or two." Several months later, 28 commits, 31 files modified, modifying over 1,000 lines of code. We are where we are today. All right. And there's also, to be fair, there was also a lot of discussion on GitHub when we were talking about, okay, but how is this going to work? A little bit of bike shedding on what names we're going to use, methods, things like that. But here's where we're at now. All right. So this is the post-coerce method coercion stuff. All right. So enums now don't silently fail on undefined values. They actually give a useful error. And so because while I get why arrays work the way they do, I'm not really sure that an undefined enum makes as much sense. Because if I just use, I don't know, if I put in some day that doesn't exist or something, like, I don't know, you wouldn't get it. So in this case, or some value that doesn't work, you should just error. So in this case, it says, hey, no value sat found in enum day. And it emphasizes value, not key. Then we've got coercion types. They can be used everywhere, finally. I'm not going to go into all the technical details of how he did this, but suffice it to say we have like undefined types, defined types, and now there's coercion types. And he even, I'll get to it a little bit, but he even joked that maybe we should have another type smiley. So those of you who've used a lot of Raku, we have like, you do :U for an undefined, like say I want this type but undefined, or D for I want this one defined. That's why we call them type smileys. And he's like, maybe we should do :C for coercion type too. And he says it jokingly, but I have a feeling this is probably going to end up in like 6.f or something. All right, but notice now we can do, so my string text only equals 25. And if I call, hey, what is text only? It's a string, which is what we wanted. All right, and did not work prior. My string text only on an array, and I just feed it a whole list of 1, 2, 3, 4, and all those values become strings. And so as it's assigning each one in, it is coercing them in. And what's even cooler, I thought, and this one I wasn't even sure when I was doing it because I've not actually done this in any of my code before, but I was like, will this work? My ints, 5, 6, 7, 8, so those are guaranteed to be ints. Now, can I just assign that array to the other one? And the answer is yes, you can. It will coerce every single one of them in as you go. So this is making our life so much easier. And like Daniel said, like this is one where you can do like, hey, safe string, hey, let's just coerce into this one. I know from this source I'm going to get a string, but I don't want to actually call this. All I have to do is put the little extra prints around to make it a coercion type. So how does it now work? Because before we said it was this very simple logic of, well, is it this? And if not, is this method exist? And then if not, we're done. And we die. Well, now if we're given this same sort of sub, right, bar as a coercion type, and I missed a line of code in there, whatever. Oh yeah, doing like foo, right? So we'll end up calling this sort of method, and those of you who aren't super deep into Raku, that little hat there means we're calling it on the higher order working stuff, so it's calling it a deeper level of stuff. And so we're going to call bar, and we're going to call this coerce method, and B, all right? And really, what is our process now? We're gonna say, hey, is B a bar? Type check successful, no coercion. Okay, I think actually in what it doesn't even go to the course unless this first one fails. Yes?
So the coerce method keyword there is just returns to believe whether it is coercible?
No, this is actually doing the process of coercion. Yeah. No end user should need to call that. This is all for like the internal stuff. I mean, you could call it if you want, but why? All right. So, but I kind of lie with this one because again, if the initial like exact type check succeeds, it won't even bother calling it. But I think mentally it's kind of good to think of that as the process. Then the next question it'll ask is, hey, does foo, right, because I called foo in here, does foo have a method bar? If it does, that is its coercion method, and foo is saying, hi, I know how to turn myself into bar, so let me do it, all right, and we will use it. If foo does not know how to turn itself into bar, then we will go to bar, and we will look for a method called coerce, all caps method, because those are reserved in Raku, so we can use it for cool stuff like this. And its argument would be foo. So we say, hey, do we have a coerce method whose first parameter, should be only parameter really, is the type that we are calling from? And if so, then we will do bar.coerce with this value, and we'll bind the result of that. Failing that, if you remember back in the design doc phase, how were they originally thinking we would do this? We would have a new method for it. And so we say, hey, does bar have a method? And we kind of actually return all the way back to that one thinking, and we say, hey, does bar have a method new that has a single argument of that one? And so you might be thinking sort of, well, why do we need new and coerce in here? I think there's probably a couple reasons. One, like new is just a convention. There's no requirement to use new for creating things. It's a lowercase method name, right? Those are not reserved. There's nothing special about them really. So the coerce one is really saying, no, we're actually taking advantage of this protocol. The new is sort of just like convention-wise, we talked about this is how most people do it. We're more likely to get older code to work by doing this. But the coerce one is really saying, hey, I'm making this method and I'm guaranteeing you don't need any options, you don't need any, named parameters or anything. Like we're having this one method to go about doing it.
Like without number 3 there, we're all depending upon convention that everybody uses.
Right, yeah. And you can imagine too, like, and here's like one where we're talking about the CSV files, right? I mean, there's like 100 million different options, on how you're going to interpret that into, an array of arrays or something. And the idea with the course is you have no options. Like it's just you're given this, and that object is already deciding. Like I have my way that, given no other options, I will, figure out how to do this. With the new one, most of the time, if I have a new, I'm probably gonna have some options in there or some other stuff, yeah, so I like to, I mean, now I'm trying to do everything with coerce just to sort of really get a nice clean separation on them. And then we've got, then finally it'll just fail. But now we have a lot more opportunities to make a successful coercion, and we have solved the problem of one class not knowing about the other class. Because in this case, foo doesn't need to know anything about bar, and we can still manage to do that coercion because bar has to figure it out. So for instance, I have in one of my modules, I have a language tag. Well, language tag is really just, most of us just think of it as a string, but it's really more of a set of attributes and whatnot, but most people will think of it as a string, and there's a lot of cases where you want to go back and forth between the two of these, and sometimes I don't want to have multi-methods to say, well, I want a language tag, or I want to take a string and then I'm going to coerce it into the language tag. I can just do this language tag type one, but the problem is it's a string that needs to coerce to language tag, and I don't want to be that guy that's going to say, I'm going to augment your core string class just to put in my language tag coercion. I could do it, but once you start augmenting, you lose all sorts of optimizations and things like that. So you really don't want to do that if you can avoid it. So now all I do is just have language tag with a method coerce from string. And it's just exactly what I had with my old multi method, where I would have multi with a string, and literally all it did was then say same with language tag.new, and then that string value. So now I've cut off, a whole extra set of code in there. So yeah, that makes a lot of things a lot easier. So now a couple of different little things to think about as we're coding in here with all this new stuff. Know that X coerce impossible exists. I think a lot of us are very bad about using typed errors, but they can be useful sometimes. So know that it exists. This was a new error type that was added in to Raku. And so if coerce has a problem, like again, it goes through that whole step of process and it cannot coerce, it will give this error. Because you've said, hey, I want you to coerce, and we've said, oh, you can't coerce here. Which is maybe a little different than, I don't know what it normally fails for, type check fail or something. It'll give you the coerce fail. And then inside the coerce method, this is one that I'm glad Vadim pointed out. It says you should prefer self.new over foo.new or class.new. And so you might be very tempted in writing coercion methods to do, well, I'm in my foo class and I'm writing my coercion methods to create my new foo, so I should do foo.new. Well, what if I've somebody's subclassed foo? And I have like foo2. And I didn't write a coercion method for foo2, but somebody did do foo2 coercion type. Well, what's it going to do? It's going to go find a coercion method on that type, and it inherited the coerce method from foo, and that one's going to say foo.new. So I don't get foo2, I get foo. And we have a problem, and that'll be a type check error. So he says make sure to use self.new, because that'll guarantee you're using the subclass type or the child class type when you're doing it. He also makes the warning, don't use coerce method, don't make it a sub-method, because then it doesn't get inherited. And actually gives an example where you have like 3 levels of inheritance, and the second one, the middle level, uses a sub-method, so then the grandchild class basically calls the grandparent class rather than the middle one, which would probably be closer and more accurate for its coercion. Oh wait, I did that one twice, sorry. Consider handling type objects separately. And this is kind of one that, kind of wonder about, but if you've got an undefined one, that maybe should be you might want to think like maybe that should be a fail more than it should be unless it's actually in like the inheritance chain, but then that would already pass anyway. So, you might want to think, should an undefined one, if I have an undefined string, should I allow that coercion to an undefined language tag? Maybe. I don't know. You might want to give a little extra thought to that one rather than just immediately coerce it. And then, of course, do the defined one separately. And remember that you could potentially get this called on an undefined object. So you want to think about that. And this is where he kind of mused that maybe we should have a C1 for a type coercion one, where the base class is that one, I guess. And then I would also add in here, really prioritize built-in classes for your coerce method. I mean, we always are working with numbers and strings, right? Those are like sort of our 2 core sets of data types that we work in any programming language. And again, you can via augment, but you want to avoid adding methods in there, and those are what most people are going to be wanting to create these objects from. You've got like some serialized string form or some numeric form. Try to add those in first, and then if you have other modules, that you're going to be using frequently, maybe take some of their classes and find ways to coerce, between it. And then use coercion types in your modules, right? Don't make me, the user of your module, have to do coercion manually. I'm lazy. If there's been any theme out of all 3 of my talks this week is I don't like boilerplate. Don't make me type more than I need to. If you can just put 2 parentheses to save me from having to write long class name dot new, some variable in whatever I'm passing, please do it. Okay? At least especially if you've got these modules where you've got, internally you've got 100 different, routines and everything, but really your external interface is just 2 or 3 2 or 3 subs. make those all coercion types for me. You're not getting any major performance hit by doing it. Yeah, and you make my life easier. And then my last one is consider implementing subset coercion as per the old docs. Is joke. But, I mean, it's completeness' sake. Like, this is all what we're lacking right now. But, yeah, in the real world, 2 smart match with even, it just reads nicer than even parenthesis 2. Okay, so, I mean, that's what you would do in actual code. And since, yes?
I had a question on the previous thing. You were talking
Yeah.
about giving coercion types in your modules.
Yeah.
That seems like potentially unexpected behavior. Like if you're trying to have an API boundary and say, you need to give me a date time, like you need to give me a coercible date time. I don't know. It seems like
So that's actually one where I would actually really like to have, and you think datetime already has a string coercion into it. And so, yeah, like I could make my own datetime, but maybe I'm pulling from a database and it's already thankfully in like ISO format. I want it to just work for me so I don't have to manually be thinking about doing that coercion. Obviously, you want to do it on ones where it's a very clear, evident, like, you don't have to think why this coercion is happening. You want it to just work. If it's going to be a little bit more of a complex one, yeah, you're going to, maybe not want to do that.
so. I guess I would say definitely use coercion types. Think about using coercion types in your public API.
Yes, that would, yeah.
Not because it weakens the type safety that you're providing in your API. Right?
It does and it doesn't, because if you think about it in a coercion, if you're coercing, you are still guaranteeing to that method that is going to be the type. And from that point forward, your code can assume that it has, say, like the date time once it's been coerced.
You're
Yeah.
exposing a broader API.
Right.
Because you're no longer saying you have to give me this. You're saying you can give me any of these.
Right. You're saying, yeah, because like I said, the alternative would be, and this is literally the issue that I had with my language tag module and a lot of my international modules that all accept language tags, is I would have these multi-methods or multi-subs where I was trying to say, okay, well, anywhere where I can take a language tag, I will also accept a string and I will attempt to coerce it to a language tag, and it just adds so much work for the programmer to get that same ease of use for the, for the end user. So yeah, I mean, there's gonna be times where, but I'm just, yeah, think about it. And like in your talk, absolutely, like that's the time. I wouldn't even say that it's helpful. I would say it's almost practically obligatory to do it that way. So I guess it's 2 questions, comments. We kind of already started some of the question comments, but if anybody's got any. Yeah.
One thought across the timeline, my guess is the answer is no, but is there any sort of a caching on origin? So if you converted a string to a date time, does the next time that needs to happen just automatic, or is it?
Okay, so the question here was if there's a way to like cache that coercion, and I have not tried this, but so if you come over to, let's say, where do I have one here? Or, well, I didn't actually give an example, but if you have that coerce method, right, there is a trait that you can apply to any method or any sub, which is cached. So you could do that. If it's going to be an expensive conversion, yeah, you could do it.
Side question.
Yeah.
Is that like memoized, just built into Raku?
Yeah, I think it's technically still on the experimental one, as I think we talked about before. Like there are these things that sometimes are experimental for a very long time, and so for myself, I have a couple of modules where I do basically exactly that because it's a large process loading stuff, and I just do a quick little like state hash, and I just say dot return with if that argument exists in it, and then if not, I go through and do it. But
Following up on that, there's also is pure, which is not experimental, which a lot of times ends up being the same thing. It is a hint to the compiler that the function is pure, and Rakudo's JIT is really pretty good at caching things that are pure, especially if it's hot coded at all. So if you use the is pure trait, you get effectively memoization.
yeah, and also with the is pure trait, what's also nice about that one is it can also attempt during the compile phase to just process that. So if you have a function like that's a square function, I can say sub square takes a value is pure, then if I call that on a known at compile time value, it will just insert that actual. It's almost like a little mini macro.
Is pure, does that mean like purely functional? Is that
Yeah, like there's no side effects or anything. Like the only things we use are the inputs. Yeah.
Which gives Raku permission to cache the current value and not run the function. That makes sense.
Yeah. There's a lot of cool things you can do with traits, and I think people are starting to have a little bit more fun with them. And I was even thinking that there might be ways to do traits with Daniel's talk too, to say like, oh, this, string A is safe equals whatever, or is unsafe, or things like that, and to kind of get some of the same, just different ways of reading it, because Tim Toady, right? We can all do it lots of ways. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
Is type construction where you do like type, open parentheses, some value, close parentheses, is that the same thing as coercion?
Yeah, and so this was an interesting one because this was in go way back here. I mean, this was like literally the first mention in the design docs of coercion was exactly that. Type, parenthesis, value, close parenthesis. I have never used that in my code for coercion. I have always done dot type, if I want to do like or type.new with the value. But I've never done that, and it works.
That's with the variable. I was talking
Right.
about the num.
Yeah, well, and that's what I was pointing out early on is it's weird because they wrote it basically saying you were going to use the num, but then they gave the example of using the variable, but to show that it's not a compiler, syntactic sugar. Yeah.
Two related points on both of this slide. If you're not doing dollar type, you actually have a type there are a lot of people who come from other languages to rate you and put int there because they're used to that in their languages. The other is everywhere that it says num, I was blaming the age of the documents, but those should all be numeric.
Yeah.
Num would be very specifically a floating point.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was kind of thinking as I was going through that is, it doesn't matter too much for the discussion, but yeah, you're right. Those. Yeah, yeah. So some of these references, for those that hear the question, some of the references here to num today would be numeric or something, or in this case, I'm trying to even think. Yeah. Because it says this course, that would still technically work. I just don't think it's what they intended for that time. Yeah, so the numeric is more of a role, like positional or associative. But essentially, I didn't know that num was originally the numeric, and so that's a nice little history point for us to all get. All right, any other? Okay.
I'm sorry I had to pop out because when I gave my talk and was talking about types and type variables, I said it as you, programmer, can coerce, Raku will force. And then I said it twice because I needed to hear that early on. It was jarring.
Right.
And then I think I handled it a little bit and said, there is a way to get Raku to coerce for you automatically, but don't. Because I thought I needed it for the longest time, it was abrasive to me, and then I just made myself work with the types of things it is, and it finally worked for me. Now, I'm very experienced, and I'm sure that when you said there's a use case that this is golden for, I just had to put that use case here, and I would have solved my point. If you see a negative to this, you see this situation that's overeducated, overused, and you lose anything from the type system restrictions as we have before.
Okay. So that's interesting. So the question was basically, is there anything that we lose by doing this? By maybe losing some strongly typed stuff, I guess, or something, right? And I don't think so. They were actually very careful when, at least on the technical side, they were very careful that this does not affect really extant code. So, I mean, this is very opt-in. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. I've certainly hit that use case a number of times. Liz has as well, which is why we were both like really pushing, like, let's get this in here. But I think it's like I said, the alternative in many cases is to have to do lots of extra like multi-candidates for a lot of things. Or you're having to remember as the programmer that, oh yeah, this method, it accepts, you know, say safe string. And gosh, now I have to always call safestring.new, like I'm always having to call those methods. And sometimes it's just easier to let, in those certain cases, to just let Raku really, to handle those coercions for you, just to save you a little bit of typing. But again, what Daniel was kind of, I think, questioning about earlier is like, once you get into that sub though, you're now guaranteed that type. And so you don't have to worry about, like, internally, you don't have to worry about doing those coercive types. But certainly I find like with the array one, that's a really useful one because sometimes you do want to pass around typed arrays for type safety's sake, but you don't want to have, if you've played around much with typed arrays, like strongly typing arrays, it is a little annoying, and this is one that I think really reduces some of that annoyance level down. Yeah.
This is kind of a thought on that, because you, I think, said better what I was thinking when I was wondering about the advice to implement coercion methods, because I was worried about some of the same concerns that you articulated, and so I think I would agree with the worry that you were, or I share the worry that you have that coercion methods can sometimes be, if overused, could make code more confusing and more magical in a bad way. And so, like, from my presentation, I had the code type, the type signature was safe string. It could have been coercible to safe string, but I think that would have been a bad use of coercion method.
Yeah.
It would broaden the API. Somebody could pass something thinking that it already was a safe string, but then get it double encoded because
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, that's a case where I think you would want to avoid the auto coercion because you're.
The same thing is true with like coercion to end. You have something that takes a coercible from any to end, and you pass it 3.2. You may not be realizing that it is dealing with 3. You're dropping
Yeah.
information when you coerce to an end. Whereas if you're coercing from a string to a date time, that's a reversible. You can always get the string back out.
Yeah.
You're not losing any information there.
Probably a good rule of thumb there. It's like, are you losing information? Is it
Yeah.
reversible?
Right.
Probably a good, might be a good candidate.
Yeah, and I don't play around with the numbers as much, but if we do coercion on int, I think does it silently just trim, or does it actually? I think or does it bomb?
No, if you have a signature that takes
It will truncate. Okay.
coercible to end, it truncates.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you can, because in core, they kind of did this whole cool thing so that theoretically everything can coerce between everything else, but then sometimes they fail. That's one thing you can always think about is it's okay to fail in a coercion. Like you can say, I'm sorry, your rectangle length and width are not the same, or width and height are not the same. I will not convert you into a square. I'm sorry, fail. I would say definitely don't feel forced to make that coercion happen if it's not. Yeah. If it doesn't make sense, don't do it, right? Don't make it coercible, but try to, where it is very, very logical to do so, I would definitely kind of provide for that to happen. I think would make a lot of people's lives easier because that's just one less utility method we've got to write when we're doing our code. Yeah. I would just put all those die statements in there. And that is actually one thing. There's a reason I point out the, where is it? If we go over here, knowing that this typed error exists. This is something that I still have seen very, vanishingly few bits of code that actually will check the error type when there's an error. Admittedly, you know, 99.9% of the time when we're doing stuff, if it fails, it just fails and we don't really care. But I don't know, sometimes if you're in a module, you might want to give a good error message back to somebody, and just doing this X course impossible, I mean, it's self-explanatory, I guess, but maybe you want to give them a little bit more feedback or some helpful advice, you know, on something else. And yeah, that's another soapbox. Use the error codes more often. Yeah, because I mean, it will give you like in the actual error message, it'll give you that code, like the error one there. But yeah, sometimes you might want to add in some extra debug information when that happens. You know. Yeah.
In fairness to users, core is not as good as it needs to be about having check errors. There's too many ad hoc.
That's
Not ad hoc, but the error type is
yeah.
ad hoc.
Yeah, and what I don't like about that one is I actually started doing, although I have not gotten anywhere near finished with it, I've actually been trying to do localized error messages. And the problem is if the error messages are ad hoc, or they'll have, even the ones that are typed, they'll have still like an actual constructed string as a portion of their contents. That's not machine readable. I mean, it could be, I could regex it maybe, but I don't want to have to rely on that. Give me like straight up attributes for each one. And so if I do a localized one, then I can kind of do it. But also then you can programmatically handle them if it's all on attributes. So that's...
That would be a great grant for somebody to do, because it'd be
I have...
boring drug work to type all of the untyped.
One of these days, I'm going to look at...
But it would be very helpful.
All right, well, I guess we are about done here. It's 6 till 12, so we got lunch now. So.